if you remember the collapse in Bangladesh of the building that a whole bunch of people died in, the work conditions, the low wages and everything, because all we want at the time, we wanted to buy $6 t-shirts. But the point is, even with all of those things, we have these moments where consumers get all upset with a brand for working with someone overseas who is not following the rules, right? And they're not compliant. But they haven't stopped buying and looking for that $6 t-shirt either.
As companies move from China to Vietnam and say, right, we're there, we've solved this problem of getting away from China or that geopolitical influence, they actually find themselves being manufactured in a Chinese-owned factory, receiving raw materials from China. So all you've done is move the production plant over here. You haven't actually changed any of the dynamics, and you certainly haven't changed the risk.
When it comes to this sort of conversation, I would step back and ask, what do we mean by supply chain resiliency in the first place? Because somehow it feels that we jump to the solutions and feel if we just move production somewhere and that'll be done. Whereas I think it needed a conversation to go back and analyze the business. Where are the problem areas? Because if we don't know that, moving production somewhere else without understanding where the materials come from, so what problems it's solving.
You're going to need to throw people at the problem internally while you figure it out. So that's why I'm saying that the historical, and by that I mean like the last 40 years of orientation towards public markets and the idea of, particularly in large organizations, of just steady state returns, is going to come under a terrific amount of pressure as businesses have to muddle through effectively, throw a whole bunch of stuff at the wall to try to figure out how to do things.
There's considerably less labor internationally in every single country to all professions. It's going to be a decade before we can figure out the pandemic and the impact and the dislocation. We do need to acknowledge that the labor that's within the supply chain, that's within manufacturing, that's within all of this, needs to essentially shake out again. But it's going to be more expensive. And we need to absorb that.
Thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newbury. I'm an award-winning strategic advisor and delivery executive. I'm focused on the rapid transformation of disrupted supply chain performance across the make, move, sell flow of consumer products and services from production to porch and assembly floor to shelf. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt, and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available from my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check these out. As the business world faces significant volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, business leaders looking to drive market-leading performance need to be tapping into thought leaders, strategic advisors, and implementation executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations, together with a strong track record of transitioning enterprises to become more agile, innovative, and digital. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started. Welcome everybody to the RetailAID podcast series, Retailing Conversations of the 2020s. I've got some excellent guests here. I've got David Marcotte, Jeff Roberts, George Minikakis, and Andoa. We're going to be talking about some interesting things about the influence of China on supply chain designs. So before we get started, if I could just ask you to introduce yourself, who you are, where you're coming from for the purpose of this conversation.
George Minikakis, Inception Retail Group. And Gary, all I'm going to say is he who controls the spice controls the universe. That's my point of starting here.
And I am a management consultant, and I focuses on data strategy and supply chain management. And I work between Asia and Canada, particularly with Vietnamese companies.
David Marcotte, I'm the Global Vice President for Retail. My position requires me to cross borders, complex processes and such. So supply chain, finance and such. My experience in the China market starts 25 years ago when I did work for a dairy farm as it was moving from being owned by the military to being a private held So I have a long history in the market, and I'm very interesting to see where the conversation goes.
Jeff Roberts, I'm a strategy consultant based out of London. Earlier in my career, I did a lot of work around particularly tax efficient supply chain management.
Thank you, everybody. So as I said, we're going to be talking about resiliency of supply chains during this session. The pandemic provided important experiences and potential lessons for businesses to become more resilient to future disruption, including, perhaps specifically for the purpose of this conversation, geopolitical risks. Some companies have switched production from China to other Far Eastern regimes, which seem to be more friendly to lessen this risk. Is this the end game, i.e. pursuing a sourcing strategy, multi-shoring, or do these moves reveal scenarios which amount to an even greater risk of future disruption? To respond to this, I'm going to pick on Anne, if you don't mind, to get this conversation going.
So we're talking a lot about supply chain resiliency. So this conversation is actually taking place in surprising many parts of the world. As a result of that, my work with the Vietnamese partners and the conversations with people over there has made me realize how active the conversations, and that there is an increasing foreign investment inquiries to places like in Vietnam. But the more you dig into the conversation, the more you're asking what really is happening, to what degree the company is actually able to move to these countries, what kind of challenge that they are facing, and what's the benefits come out of that. So that is where I started to make me realize that we need to have a conversation and think a little bit more about what exactly we're doing with the move, what are the practical considerations, and what's the benefits or the challenge that we're looking at.
I'm going to read a quote I found from Mario Draghi. He was referring to inflation, but I want you to hear the last part of this. What he said was, he was talking about inflation, but he was talking about the fact that global conflicts are creating problems. And he says they're rather both a consequence of paradigm shift, which over the past 2.5 decades has quickly moved global geopolitics from competition to conflict. You know, I'm looking at 2025 to 2030 and saying, hoping that we're a more robust market and the economy is more stable and everything. But the challenge there is there's always the risk of escalation of conflicts, tensions between major powers. Look, China is saying the South China Sea belongs to them. It's just not reality anymore. And you have to wonder what you do next and how you manage these risks. There are opportunities to get to reshore or get closer to shore and find new partners, but there are also risks associated with that too, right? And then there's one other one that comes to mind, and I know I'm loading up the plate here, but the other one is it's environment and sustainability, right? They really play a big role in all of this in terms of relationships with other retailers and supply chains.
What's quite interesting is that actually what we're saying is not necessarily, say, active hostility or even a shift in cost, which is what drove obviously the last sort of 30 years of things, is that obviously it's a case of more preemptive political intervention, which seems to be driving things, which I think for most people managing in this environment, there's very limited direct experience, right? So I think the last time we saw things like this, that probably led to such a large shift was probably OPEC embargoes of the 70s, where there was somewhat of a stranglehold on a key resource element that was, geographically speaking, quite a long way away. So I think what's going to be really interesting is not only the shifts that it will necessitate as governments, particularly led by the US, and then the EU sort of dances around it. I mean, there's been some weirdness in Germany recently in particular. But the interesting thing that's been going on there is as the US starts to push for, say, stronger resilience, they're trying to solve dual problems, I think, right? Internal domestic issues of trying to ameliorate inequality, and then international issues of ensuring that it maintains its position on the global stage and sort of pulls the rest of its trading partners behind it. It's a space that most executives, irrespective of field, I think, haven't necessarily had to face down. And so I think it's quite an interesting one. And what's been most interesting as well is that there's the dichotomy of it, that you have people like AstraZeneca actively doubling down on the Chinese market, even looking at spinning off Chinese business, IPOing it there. People like Germany, auto manufacturers in Germany, pointing to the fact that it's entirely too strong a market to look to exit and exerting quite a bit of pressure on German government. It's an interesting thing, though, is that what you're saying is that because there's not an active move as a result of direct warfare or there's not open hostilities, it's more of an advisory state. And I think that's what's been the interesting thing, is that there's not direct experience of managing it. and then the wide variety of management responses that we've seen to.
It's an interesting siloing of thinking that's been going on since day one, which is I'm concentrated on trade, I'm concentrated on the manufacturing, the labor pool, I'm concentrated on the supply of key materials and then half-finished materials. And then you get into questions about reshoring and such. And then there is the other part, which I mentioned, which is any semblance of knowledge of internal dynamics of the countries in question. And China always has been either in front of the curtain or behind the curtain, but there's always a substantial amount of what's going on in China that's not clear or evident because of the nature of the country and the way it's been governed for many, many years. What we're seeing at the moment is a lot of confusion being caused by the changes in that one, the dynamics of the population, the dynamics of changes of employment, the shift of a majority of youth into education when most of the jobs are uneducated. We see this in other countries as well. When China becomes more opaque, it makes it more difficult for you to start making those decisions. When you see reshoring and such, overwhelmingly, this is new manufacturing where it comes down to, do I build here or do I build there? And this is what we've seen particularly in Mexico, where high-end complex manufacturing is being opened in Mexico, but overwhelmingly it's not being moved to Mexico. There's some interesting examples of that we should pay attention to, such as Shine is now opening a factory in Mexico. They're also opening a factory in Europe because they're looking at their ability to manage the Chinese market as a manufacturing base creates tensions in the other silos. And they're moving progressively on it. You're seeing the same thing with Pinduoduo, Temu, etc. All of the different retailers that we see are starting to move outward into other markets as a base so as to create a more stable environment. But I think, you do touch on one that is constantly confusing, which is we've successfully ignored the internal dynamics of China for 20 years. And that doesn't work very well if you're going to have them being, 60, 70% of your finished product. And that's something that we need to contend with.
For me, though, when it comes to this sort of conversation, I would step back and ask, what do we mean by supply chain resiliency in the first place? Because somehow it feels that we jump to the solutions and the conclusion and feel if we just move production somewhere and that'll be done. Whereas I think it needed a conversation, go back and analyze the business. Where are the problem areas? Because if we don't know that, moving production somewhere else without understanding where the materials come from, so what problems it's solving, to me, it's a lot of talk and not the right course of action, or even if it is seemingly right course of action, it would not give you the results that you want. For example, I could say production's assembly could move to another country, but if all the parts in that particular location would not be able to have the ecosystem to provide that, for example, right? So I think that before we even talk about where to move or what sort of risk and all that, I think a lot of time companies need to look internally first and understand the supply chain, which is supply chain transparency apparently is an issue for many, that they don't really know where everything is coming from and how to intertwine partners all work, right? So for me, it's the first step. And then we can talk about specific locations, risk, what to do about it, and how to make it happen, right?
There's a couple of points I've picked up already. One is the US government and now Canadian government are asking companies who bring stuff into their respective countries to check for modern slavery. Most organizations say we've got full transparency, we've got full visibility, we know what's what in our supply chain. Clearly, during the pandemic, all they could just about see was their interface with their first-tier partners.
I would disagree. This is not a new topic. This is something that goes back easily 10, 15 years in the apparel business. And that's the important differentiator here. Is in the apparel business based on subcontracting, moving it from country to country to country. Invariably, you wander into this brand destruction of slave labor, child labor, sustainability violation, whatever you wish. And the apparel industry has done a very good job of finding means of documentation, mitigation, rapid response when there's an issue. And I think that's where we should look in terms of this topic, in that other companies are now coming to terms with, okay, I don't make apparel, but I do need to answer these questions where I didn't have to contend with them before. So this is a cross-industry question. It's not necessarily a new one in that sense. It does reflect, the core of supply chain and containerization, which is I can make it anywhere, I can pack it anywhere, I can ship it anywhere. And anywhere equals some very interesting and dicey situations. I mean, in the apparel business, over the years, I've noticed this has become baked into the entire QA process, quality assurance. Is not only do I dictate through the bill of materials, this is how you're going to make it and where you're going to make it, but these are the conditions for acceptance. I'm not going to take your product if you cannot document where it comes from. And as you bake it into the system, then it becomes less and less and less an issue. We just haven't gone there in the rest of the business.
The second issue, which sparked this conversation, which was a conversation I had with Anne offline, which was as companies move from China to Vietnam and say, right, we're there, we've solved this problem of getting away from China, or that geopolitical influence, they actually find themselves being manufactured in a Chinese-owned factory, receiving raw materials from China. So all you've done is move the production plant over here. You haven't actually changed any of the dynamics, and you certainly haven't changed the risk. You may have actually increased the risk because you're perhaps blind to the fact that influence still exists. In fact, it's probably hardened in some ways.
You saw that originally with the Japanese 20 years ago moving into China for the same reason. The labor, the skill set, everything else, their ability to pick up on it. And as you were talking about conflict, there's a substantial amount of manufacturing from Taiwan is done in China. So there's this parallel path that emerges there that needs to be acknowledged. And again, back to Vietnam. Vietnam's been a lot of fun to watch in that they've invested into an educational system that has produced a very different workforce than one would expect. And you're seeing a substantial amount of manufacturing, particularly in consumer electronics, moving to Vietnam to respond to that. But at the same time, the capital has to come from someplace. The other issue that's here, and this is one, again, we don't understand the region well enough to address, is the huge surge of Chinese immigration into Southeast Asia across all countries back in the 1800s, which left behind a substantial amount of manufacturing and retail conglomerates, families, expertise in the hands of expat Chinese. So you have family connections that facilitate this, but don't make any of it easy to understand. Let's not get confused there. So the current one is, as you know, it's Chinese capital moving into Vietnam to take advantage of an environment there, which is either cheaper, more easier to manage, whatever, and also to manage the socio-economic issues they're having with the West. That's fine. But the key word I always react to is move. They're not moving manufacturing. They're opening new manufacturing. It's just that in China, it's not where they would have opened it before. It's not occurring as it has in the past. That imbalance is the one that we're currently coming to terms with.
I can add to what David has been saying, and Gary, particularly Gary, around the first point that you were making about the US and Canada, making sure there's no slave labor behind all this. I've lived in China for 3.5 years, and I can tell you that one dynamic that I noted in China was the Chinese people there have changed their minds a little bit, but when it came to foreign goods, if they were made in their country, they didn't like them. That's one thing that I recognized. They didn't like foreign goods made in their own country. They wanted to see that it came from Italy or it came from the UK or Germany. That was important to them. So it was very interesting. But for everyone else in the Western world that's buying goods from Asia, regardless of what country it's at, the one thing that really strikes me is that if you remember the collapse in Bangladesh of the building that a whole bunch of people died in, so the work conditions, the low wages and everything, because all we want at the time, we wanted to buy $6 t-shirts. But the point is, even with all of those things, we have these moments where consumers get all upset with a brand for working with someone overseas who is not following the rules, right? And they're not compliant. But they haven't stopped buying and looking for that $6 t-shirt either. There's this split here And retailers and other industries have a challenge, with their customers, is to satisfy them that they're doing things the right way and that they have responsible suppliers that are transparent, that are doing the right things. And they, as a company, are following and auditing and doing all the checks that they should be. But those things are going to slip through the cracks. I hope the listeners here don't think that this is all of it. The whole thing is far more complex than just what the consumer thinks, but the consumer does ignite a lot of fires for retailers and manufacturers to act on their supply chains. The key here, though, is that you should be very diligent on your supply chains, that you never have to face that. And I think that's the biggest problem.
At the end of the day, business have to make decisions that make sense to them, that they could practically implement, right? So the statistics come out that there's a lot of inquiries into investment into the Vietnamese economy in the past 12 months. But that's inquiries. For it to actually happen, that's a whole other story, because for business to come in, whether or not they're from American or Canadian companies, from Europe or wherever it is, that they're coming in and they wanted it to expand their productions or increase their diversify their sourcings, faced with the reality that it takes energy, takes effort, and it takes money to develop new suppliers, to work in a whole new environments. And they can assume that whatever worked before will, work in one region, one country, will continue to work everywhere else. And I think that is where the problems that we're seeing, that the wish, the desire, the talk about multi-sourcings and moving and all that, whether or not it could actually happen depends on so many other factors. And we're not even talk about reshoring, right? That's a whole other set of concerns if we talk about bringing production back to Canada or America or Europe, right? So that's a whole other set of concerns that we need to talk about.
I just want to reach back to a point David made, which I thought was a really good one, which I think sort of stitches together a lot of what we've talked about so far, which was this idea of the business operating more or less in distinct silos in its place, where you worried about how your supply chain operated more or less independently from, in my experience and what feels like the dark ages when I used to do tax efficient supply chain stuff, it was always kind of a run-in with marketing, right? So that they really had no understanding how any of the stuff showed up on shelf. They just assumed sort of magic happened. They'd come up with an idea and then, I don't know, somebody waved a wand. And so when you were starting to consolidate it for whatever reason, there was always a run-in on that front. And so what I think is quite interesting is, irrespective of the driver, what I think is going to be really challenging for companies is that supply chains have traditionally been real stalwarts for cost reduction, right? You need to get a lot of money out of the business. You can go ask the supply chain guys, A, because they generally had pretty good data, B, because they generally had pretty good handle on where things were going. They were able to track things through, and so they were quite easy in inverted commas, but easy to get the money out, right? So it was there. So I think what's going to be interesting is that there's a prevailing logic, right, that large companies tend to be oriented towards public markets. There's an expectation of steady returns, et cetera. And the way that you did that was that you could rely on supply chain guys to basically, when cuts needed to happen, you could push that through. It was a lot easier to do that than to potentially try to pump marketing, or it was easier in the short term. You had a clearer timeline on when you get it back. I think particularly as things get a bit more volatile globally, economically, we're experiencing it now, and I suspect it's going to get more intense for the foreseeable future. There'll be this expectation that we're able to free up more capital to hand back public markets, whatever, that's going to go on there. But if you're facing the conflicting pressure of either outright political pressure of you can't trade with these partners now, or you have restrictions on what you can and can't trade with these partners, and then you have the added pressure of we need to find new places to either source or to site manufacturing. There's the startup cost rather of getting it up, right? How you got to get the facility online. There's always a delay. It's never at full capacity for X amount of time. All of these factors come through, I think, which is going to create a really, for lack of a better word, weird dynamic that's really going to sort of shape things. There's still going to be the expectation that we can meet the quarterly, half yearly, and annual revenue targets, that we're going to be able to hit profit targets, that we're going to be able to hand back. Earnings per share will continue their high single-digit growth, whatever, that's going to go through. And then the place where you used to be able to go and pull the lever to free up some cash when you needed it is going to be competing with a whole bunch of, even more than they currently do, going to be carrying even more challenges they have to deal with. And I think, to my mind, that's going to be the real challenge, because supply chains historically, at least my experience has been principally in retail and consumer products, that tend to get managed in a separate world to the rest of the business, right? They know what they're doing. We leave them alone. When we need cash, we go squeeze a bit, money comes out, we're able to hand it back. And it's going to be, I think, really challenging to continue to try to operate like that against all the expectations on the front of the business, to deliver things, consumer expectations, shareholder expectations, whatever the case may be. And then asking the supply chain guys to continue doing the work that they were doing, which was already complicated, but you're adding an additional complexity to that. I think that's going to be, to my mind, the real thing to watch, which is it's going to force a business to really rethink how they operate.
Back in 2020, when the pandemic started, I was advising clients in large numbers. I said, go find your supply chain guys. I know you don't know who they are. Okay, buy a case of beer, take it downstairs, because I'm pretty sure they're in the sub basement, and make friends, because they're going to save your life for the next 2 years. And if you don't know that, you're going to know it within about 6 months. And you know what? One of the things that came out of the pandemic, all of our clients came to the realization, we need to understand what's going on there, even though in truth, the supply chain guys don't want to say, well, we have tremendous data, but 200 pieces of that is still on bloody paper. Okay, I can't ship a container without 200 pieces of paper. That's still true. And when one company, Maersk, created, a blockchain solution to do that, nobody else would buy into it, because you find out the other part of supply chain, which we unfortunately know, which is it's a bunch of pirates that don't trust each other. Okay, so pirates work really well together when they can see the money at the other end, but once the money is not there, they stop working together, which is actually where we are now with strikes. And this comes back to the other question that connects us back to China and into other countries. The overall seaboard and almost all elements of the supply chain right now have labor shortages. And at the same time, they have significant conflict in regards to strikes, some of which are being resolved, let's be honest with it. But what we don't appreciate is the misallocation of labor that's currently in China that's impacting this as well. The efficiencies we saw before are not there, and they're still shaking their way out. We forget that they basically delayed going through the pandemic by 2 years, went through it. We have no idea what happened. It's all behind the curtain in its own way. So the 2 words I'm giving clients for 2024, one of them is ambiguity. You're just going to have to deal with ambiguity, because you're going to constantly be in this, I'm not sure what's going on, but I got to get it done. And the other side, which you really alluded to, is complexity. We have got to absorb the complexity and really come to terms with it, other than putting those guys in the sub basement and forgetting what their names were again. So that's my public announcement for the moment. We can move on.
It's kind of interesting, isn't it, that when we think back to the old model of retailing, where we used to deal with local suppliers, we're in the country and we're dealing with local suppliers, so we can remove the complexity of geopolitical pressures and time and distance and all these things. And we used to say to ourselves, if we can just work with a supplier, we can get some stuff in, get a couple of pallets across, put it into a warehouse, disperse it across our network, monitor the rate of sale. Oh, it's a runner, or it needs this mod. Communicate that really quickly to our local suppliers, send in a truck of that. We get the truck in, we disperse it, it turns into money pretty quickly, and it all works. As I said in previous podcasts, we've displaced that model. It seemed almost simple model, but it was effective, to actually move to a geographically extended supply chain, all the risks involved in that, without the geopolitical risks, of course, of which China does represent. And cash flow has completely changed. We used to be a negative working capital thing. So as sales grew, our cash would grow. If we think about where we are now, and I think I'm coming to a conclusion during this conversation, that although we might want to move back to some kind of localized solution, or regionalized, the word that seems to be popping up often, regionalized supply chains, I think that we're stuffed if we keep the financial model the same. To what Jeff said, this gentle drip feed of dividends. If we can keep the dividends there, management keep their job, they keep their incentives, everything's perfect in the garden. If China kicks off and there's some major disruption, well, surely we're all in the same boat. So what do you expect us to do as individual companies? But I think that we need to push that envelope and actually think that the only way we can look at this in the longer term is we need to protect ourselves from such wide ranges of risks. which does take me back to more localized supply chain designs, working with local suppliers ideally in country, if not, say, if you're in Canada, across North America, to try and keep these risks away from our supply chain and to remove some of the ambiguity, to remove quite a lot of the complexity.
I'd like to add another thing that I think, David, you were talking about the workforce and all. And I think it is a trend that not just in one particular country, but in a lot of different countries, and Vietnam is included, is that as the younger generations are a lot more educated and they love to work more in IT, in tech, in all other fields. So even Vietnamese manufacturers are actually facing problems with hiring low-paid, simple, skilled workers. So it's not a challenge of one particular country, and I would see that it's across the continents as people are a lot more educated, exposed to what are the alternative careers that they have, the cost advantage that may not be there in the long term. So what do we do? How do we make a country more attractive for business? How do we help business to move there, as opposed to say, well, you can't do business in one country because there's all the bad things happening, right? So how do we become more attractive? Then the conversation should not just be, well, because the policy is in place that you can't do business in another part of the world for whatever reason, or conflict and obvious conflict, but more of why it is a good thing, right? So it's both business and governments, and I would assume that business need to be prepared for it, which is, unfortunately, we're in a situation where most business now have much tighter budgets, a harder time, which is usually always the case. When you need to take drastic action, that's when you don't have money to do anything. We don't have the people to do the right thing. And then also a whole host of other government policies and the whole eco-environment, as in not just one business can just simply move and then that would happen, right?
I'm reminded of my mother, who used to tell me, George, you haven't thought about what if. For example, what will happen if you don't do your bed? What the pandemic taught me was that not everybody was prepared for the what ifs. We've kind of have been rolling along feeling really good and comfortable about a lot of things, and that the world was great. Unfortunately, it's not the case. And I believe right now, the what if is, what if things destabilize? Where do you go from here? I believe that if I was running another company today, that would be the challenge for the supply chain people and for everybody else in the organization. Where do we go from here if things don't work out? If there's a risk. I'm sure that the bigger organizations are playing those scenarios out and have solutions, but we all know that 60 or 70% of all businesses are small, and they don't play out those scenarios. It's great to be talking about the big companies, but our economies don't run just on big companies. They run on a lot of small ones, and they need to collectively start thinking about it too, because the world is not the same as it was last year. The Ukraine has taught me that as well, and we need to be more diligent. So I agree with everything everyone has said. Everything is changing. And David, I have been to the basement, and they had grown long beards in there and everything, so because nobody visits. And look, the supply chain guys, Gary knows this. I think the supply chains are kingmakers of retailers. Just the retailers don't know it. But at the end of the day, right now, the biggest question I have is, what if something else changes? We are in that kind of fluid dynamic in the marketplace in the world that something else could change and could dramatically impact us.
Last year, talking about the Ukraine, telling clients what to expect, the distortions, what we need to do. And about 2-3 months ago, I presented to a client that said, what about the Ukraine? And I said, here's the interesting thing is we're a year further on, and I can't tell you any distortions they're bringing to the market because we've found alternative solutions for every single one. And that is the flexibility globally we have, for better or for worse. Now, could something bigger than the Ukraine happen? God help us, no. And I mean that sincerely. That's about as big as I think any of us want to even come to play. But there is an amazing amount of flexibility that's come into all of this. Oh, by the way, the supply chain people start showing up at trade shows, and I would stop at their booth and I said, you guys look like dogs at a cat show. You really don't fit in. And then I would spend an hour with them because I had a blast. It's partially because nobody else would talk to them because they were all scared of them. But all that said and done, the critical nature of them on the fly. Jeff says what many companies believe is supply chain is a very well organized process, lots of data. I came out of IBM designing supply chains because it was the most data environment. You follow the data and you made money. Well, no, the data is not that easy. The processes are not that predictable because you do need at every single point that human being. The what if side of it is astonishingly important. But again, we're back into, if there's one thing we learned to our detriment during the pandemic is well-made plans last about 12 minutes. That ambiguity and flexibility is the challenge of the moment. And we're still in the midst of it. The political side is always there. Unfortunately, like too many of here, I have too much years underneath my belt. So I do recall, boycotts on Japanese products because they're destroying the United States and Canada. I recall that distinctly. Now, I would mention one thing about reshoring that I find interesting is that one of the frustrations you have for particularly small to medium companies is going to China and trying to figure it out. How do I work here? How do I get things? And invariably they get a broker. Whereas they go to Colombia or Mexico and it all makes sense. The culture is not that different from the US or Canada. And the communication is easier. A friend of mine out of San Diego was telling me, the great thing is I can drive to the factory in 2 hours. That type of thinking. I live in Tucson. Tucson is filled with people from Mexico every single weekend. And somebody said, how can you tell? I said, well, they dress better, they have better cars because they're all coming out of the factories. Understanding that ongoing dynamic, I think, is really, really important, especially when you talk about smaller companies. I think smaller companies are the ones that are driving the reshoring that we're not seeing. And I think that's worth taking apart.
If we think that supply chain people are homogenous, I recently got sight of Korn Ferry supply chain talent survey of 2023, where senior people were asked about what were the biggest hotspots around the supply chain. And they talked about the talent shortage, but they said there was no talent shortage in detailed operational roles. We've got that covered. Don't worry about that. We're not misquoting it, but it's kind of like they're 10 a penny. What is missing is those people who can do transformational change, who can lead that, can actually design that. And there's a massive gap in the marketplace. But if we're actually saying we need to make some change here, we need to reshore, multi-shore, nearshore, whatever it is, I would have thought that supply chain would have played a strong part in what is the dynamic of that? What are the possibilities? What should we be considering? And if we've got 10,000 people who are good at picking stuff, getting out the door, getting it loaded into a truck, we turn to those individuals and say, this is what we think we need to be doing. We've got a strategy in terms of the business, but we now need to get the supply chain underneath us to make that happen. Who can we turn to? It's not really a big surprise that they turn to the likes of Deloitte's, because they might actually look across their piece and actually say, we haven't got the skills and we don't know how to get those skills because they're not well-rehearsed skills, except for people who sometimes, like me, work in the space of interim management. I sat here through the pandemic, and this is not a party political broadcast, and my phone didn't ring that often. And that's an indictment as to how blinkered some of our businesses, and I'm not just talking about retailers, think about the supply chain. Absolutely, you're right, David, with your point is go and find them, take them a beer, get to know their names, for goodness sake, but also understand that the people who are good at firefighting, because often the supply chain is reduced to a massive firefight, actually find those people who can think their way through problems and try and resolve where we're trying to get to, as opposed to just getting through each day, one day at a time. As we wrap up on this, is there any last points? So this is a highly complex area with lots of different variables in play.
This is a really interesting but complicated topic, and it affects a very wide range of companies, and like George said, particularly a lot of SMEs in multiple parts of the world, not just the companies from over here buying somewhere else, but also companies that make the product, sells the product, a lot of parts. So it's really changing landscape for many businesses that I fear a lot of them either don't realize or realize and don't know what to do about it. It is a situation that should be acknowledged by managers and deal with, because to assume that things would just go back to normal for everyone, for buyers, the sellers, the makers, and all that, assume that things go back to normal, it's probably not going to be the case.
The key one we've referred back and forth, but the one I really do focus on repeatedly is labor. There's considerably less labor internationally in every single country to all professions. It's going to be a decade before we can figure out the pandemic and the impact and the dislocation here. We don't have enough time for that. But we do need to acknowledge that the labor that's within the supply chain, that's within manufacturing, that's within all of this, needs to essentially shake out again. But it's going to be more expensive, and we need to absorb that also. It's funny dealing with clients in this context. I had one the other day said, so UPS might go on strike. What does that mean? And I said, well, that's half of all parcel posts in the world, and nobody else can make up that difference. They said, oh, okay, well, who's the Teamsters? And now I really had a problem, because it's like the Teamsters is the largest union in North America, and they have an incredible amount of clout politically, which is part of the part that people kind of miss. And it all comes back to labor. We have to do a better job of understanding that labor picture in our planning, as opposed to simply where's the lowest cost? Where's the simple alternative? Even when we're talking about, do we need alternative factories and such, it still comes back to labor. People are surprised when I tell them there's a labor shortage in Mexico. There's a labor shortage in Vietnam. There's a labor shortage in India. All of these things are significant in terms of this planning. We don't have a model for that yet. And that's the one that I think we need to start struggling with as we go forward.
To bomb the crater David just made, that's the main point, right? There needs to be a fundamental acceptance that there will be a period of elevated cost, and that it is going to be a case of muddling through. And not only the elevated costs, is that there will be a period, I suspect for at least the foreseeable, where it will look like there is labor redundancy within your business. So you're struggling for things outside. You're going to need to throw people at the problem internally while you figure it out. So that's why I'm saying that the historical, and by that I mean like the last 40 years of orientation towards public markets and the idea of, particularly in large organizations, of just steady state returns, is going to come under a terrific amount of pressure as businesses have to muddle through effectively, throw a whole bunch of stuff at the wall to try to figure out how to do things. Some of it will be a lot of manual handling. Some of it will be just requiring more people to problem. Some of it will be doing things and having to undo it and then direct it in a new thing. And I think as we navigate that reality, I think it's going to be quite difficult for a lot of organizations from all kinds of fronts.
As the only government I've seen proactively act on the labor shortage is Canada, which you would never expect, because Canadian government's usually not capable of that type of dynamic action, but just putting the pens in, if you wish. But that said, basically, if you can show up in Canada, you can figure out how to get into it. The immigration quota now is above 500,000 in a country that, when they started this, was 37 million. I really did enjoy the Globe and Mail the other day when they said, oh my God, there's 40 million Canadians. We lost track, but that's what's required. I would say the United States right now is pulling in about 2 million. Whether they're counting or not is an interesting question. There is a global competition here for labor. And that kind of changes the discussion into some interesting political dynamics. Almost no government in the world likes immigrants. It's one of those dynamics we've never resolved.
Labor issue and immigration, it feels like you're taking from Peter to give to Paul. One nation loses, the other one benefits. It's just a rotating immigration, it feels like. I will tell you that many years ago, about a decade ago, I sat in a meeting at a university, and the board that was there was talking about immigration and getting more people to work in supply chain. And I asked the question, how come you're not focusing on other industries that have supply experts? Well, no, we want to create our own. And I thought, well, that's kind of silly, right? That you're focusing on your own industry to find experts when supply experts exist elsewhere, and they can bring a great diversity in knowledge and experience adds value. I think that there's more to this labor issue than we understand, and that the government and the people tracking everything really understand it. It needs to be addressed. And I don't believe immigration alone is going to solve it, because there's an education element that comes into this as well. And I'll tell you one thing, I've got family members that are managers in the manufacturing world and executives. They're letting people go, which is another interesting piece that just kind of baffles me. Where's the supply chain issue on talent if you're letting people go? Part of it is that 70% of the Canadian and US economy is based on service sectors. Everybody gets a degree, everybody wants to work in a nice, clean office place. But that's not where all the jobs are. And I think when we start digging deeper, we'll realize that the jobs are elsewhere and they don't demand a university degree. There are opportunities out there if you want to take them, right? But I think this is going to be an aha moment for societies, for the Western societies. You've hit plateau on a lot of these white collar jobs, and the other jobs that are being developed are waiting for you. And I think that's the turning point.
I agree with the labour availability issue, wherever it manifests itself. And some part of this is, I don't know if we've actually talked about this before, a demographic bomb of our reproduction rate is diminishing, and that's causing some issues. And to David's point on Canada being very proactive, maybe it's reacting to the demographic bomb rather than the wider economic needs. And to George's point that he made last about the retraining, it's not just labour, it's not homogenous. The jobs aren't homogenous, therefore the labour can't be homogenous. There has to be a real ramping back up of retraining people into jobs that are required for the future. But one passing thought alongside labour, I think that we really need to dig deep into what raw material source is. Where is that source? Which regime is it in, or what regimes can it be obtained from? Is it sustainable? Is it a short-term thing? If we're using something that's farmed, is it farmed from that place because of climatic conditions which don't exist anywhere else in the world? And what do we need to do to make sure it is sustainable if that's the only source of raw materials to feed our production supply chain as such? And the other thing around that is the ability to play off lead time, such as geographically extended supply chains versus something local. We need to be able to conceive that model and then make the right choices around that. So this has been, as I expected, a very wide and diverse set of perspectives on this whole area that doesn't seem to get too much press. The reality is that when I read through columns, they're all about, making small incremental changes, almost detached from the business. But the business and the supply chain do need to dovetail together again, much the same as they did probably in the early stages of a pandemic when it all came together. Silos were dispensed with, budgets were dispensed with. We focused on getting the stock and getting it to the customers by whatever means and as quickly as possible. So I'd like to thank David Marcotte, George Minikakis, Jeff Roberts, and Andoa for contributing to this fascinating conversation. And thank you, everybody out there, for listening in, watching in right to the end here. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss a vital episode. And importantly, stay safe and stay tuned. Thank you. Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your organization. You can connect with me via my website, RetailAID.ca, go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn and connect with me there. Please feel free to follow the experts on this podcast for more insights and to join in the conversation. I look forward to collaborating with you and playing an active part with your supply chain and business's transformation as you are inspired to think big, be bold, scale, adapt, and win.